Hi, I'm Joey Ament,
And I'm Roberto Segura.
and we are interviewing David Novak on the topic of 50s and 60s. He's going to talk about his life. All right, so I'll start with the first question. What was your earliest memory?
Oh boy. uh, as a child, I remember playing with, as a young child, maybe 4 or 5. I remember playing down in the basement with my sister, uh, playing with a bunch of boxes. Uh, that's what came to my mind when you asked that question. The first thing that I can remember.
Is there, do you think that's any different nowadays with children, how there's more toys and there's a lot less innovation with in children's minds?
I don't think so. I think kids have great imagination. They have more toys and more things to play with than probably I had as a young kid in terms of objects, but they're going to play the same way. Build houses, build forts, whatever they can muster up to have fun. And I think it depends on if they've got sisters, brothers, or if they've got playmates. That makes a difference too.
Yeah, of course. And you were born in 1940, so were any of the games that you played more war-oriented and because you were born during World War II?
No, I do not remember war-orientated. I remember two things. One is the typical cowboy wanted to have the 6-shooter and the dress up like a cowboy with a hat. I remember that. And the second thing I remember, we used to make out of bushes. We'd make bows with string and then we'd cut some other bushes to make arrows, and we'd play cowboys and Indians mostly. I don't remember playing much war at all.
Any other things that just in general you played when you were very young that come to mind? Any specific memories?
Well, it was the playgrounds were big when I was young. The big attraction. There wasn't much else. In our neighborhood, there was a small wading pool, Clark Square, that we could spend time. But in my childhood, mom would kick us out of the house, or we would ask to go out of the house, and we'd go to the playground, and we'd play, and primarily in the summer, we'd play all day long. And they had what we called coaches, which were young teenagers that took care of the baseball bats and the games. In those days, very few kids had their own baseball bat or glove. You'd get it loaned to you at the playground, and then you had to turn it back in. And kickballs. They had lots of games that the board games, checkers, chess, and Battleship. Played a lot of Battleship. I also remember at the playground marbles. Marbles was big when I was a kid, and you made a little hole. Again, we didn't play the circle marbles. You played a little hole against the school building, and then you'd stand in a circle, a semicircle, around the hole at various distances, and you try and get your marble into the hole. And you took turns, and basically it was the winner took all. The number of if you had the most marbles in the hole at the end of the game, I don't remember how we cut it off, but you got the marbles that were in the hole, and you'd start another game. So that I remember we did a lot. I doubt very seriously if kids today play marbles. And then we had monkey bars. They're nowhere near what you got today. They were steel, and there was a metal ladder on top of it, and you played that. And that was the only play equipment on the playground where I went. Was Longfellow High School on 21st and Scott. And I mean, it was just loaded with kids, because in those days, parents just, they let their kids go. And I can remember my mom would come, she'd walk down the alley toward the playground, and I could hear her whistle, and I knew it was lunchtime. So then we went home for lunch, and then we'd go back out again. But it was mostly playgrounds. We rode our bikes a little bit, but not much in terms of touring or trips. It was mostly right up through early teens. It was the playground.
Do you, do you believe that a lot of these kids are missing out on experience, mainly because kids nowadays are staying inside with all the technology and everything?
Yes. Yes, I think let me just say, I don't know if they missed the experience, but it's a different experience. When you think about what we did when I was a kid, that's a form of social media. It just was lots of conversations, lots of meets and greets. There was no technology. But, you know, today you're doing it, and obviously we're doing it right now. I can see you too, you see me, and we're communicating. So in some respects it's the same, but in other respects it's different. I think it's just a change in times. Parents were not concerned about leaving their kids run around the neighborhood alone and going off wherever. As I suggested, we did not have any, at least I didn't, and I don't think my sisters did either, any reason to go anyplace else, to go on long walks or bike trips. So they didn't worry about us. Today, I think parents are more worried about knowing where their kids are, what they're doing. And that's just a sign of the times, I think.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to talk about that topic?
What I remember?
Yeah, I mean, it's fine if you don't. We'll probably come back to it somehow. But
yeah, no, I mean, I'm thinking about my early childhood. I'm saying basically 10 and younger. You know, when I got to be 10, we started to explore more. One of the things that was interesting prior to 10 was within 4 or 5 blocks of my house, there was a public natatorium. In those days, many homes did not have bathtubs or showers. Many, many people went every day to the public natatorium to take a shower. But there was also a swimming pool. And we would spend time going as less than 10. We'd walk over to the natatorium when it was kids' hours, and we would swim. And you could swim in the winter, and you could take a shower in the winter. My house did have a bathtub, but initially when I was young, there was very little hot water. There was no hot water tank. There was a system where you could heat the water up, but it took a long time. And I remember taking baths as a young kid, and just like all young kids do, and my mom would wash me up. But then you know, when I got more independent, I usually went to the natatorium to shower and clean myself up.
Okay. Moving on to another question. Do you remember what Wisconsin was like during and just directly preceding World War II? I guess there wouldn't be much memories for you during.
No,
but
no, I don't. I was born just well, a year or a year and a half before the war started, so I don't remember any of the before World War II. During and after, yeah, got memories. So
Yeah, just elaborate on any of the memories like of
Well-
your childhood in World War II.
yeah, my folks did my dad was exempt from going into being drafted or going into the service. And we would spend a lot of time that I remember. They'd save up their gasoline rationings, and we would go on trips to the farm because they were born on the farm about 130 miles from here, around Stevens Point area, which is Polish. Our family is Polish, and and we'd go see grandma and grandpa and aunts and uncles. And I remember traveling on roads that you do not see today anymore. Gravel, dirt roads. The highways were very narrow. They were asphalted, but very narrow. You went through every town. You'd run into farmers walking their cows down the road, and you had to drive very carefully or wait until the cows got off the road. And in wintertime, there was very little plowing. And when you went in the wintertime, you had to be careful if it was snowy, because you get stuck in snowdrifts. And I can remember twice. One memory I have where my dad went and got the farmer to get his tractor and pull us out of the drift. And I was 5 or thereabouts, right at the end of the war. And one time I remember walking from the car to my uncle's house. So it was a lot different than it is today with the expressways and the super highways, and those are the memories I had right after the end of the war.
Okay.
About Wisconsin.
Yeah.
I can remember watching. My dad stopped and he says, "Here they come," and watch, and just hundreds and hundreds of ducks and geese were flying over us. That was near Horicon Marsh. I can read pictures that in my mind right now.
I did have a follow-up, but I want to ask that later.
Okay.
So you talked about how you were a spectator in the Douglas MacArthur parade when he visited Milwaukee. Can you
Yes.
explain that memory?
Yes, that was 1951. Douglas MacArthur had just been fired by President Truman for basically insubordination, for not following orders that the president wanted him to. But he was a famous general, and he was a good general. He was requested by Congress, and he made a speech in Congress and made the famous quote, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." And he had a big ticker tape parade down New York after he came back, and then he must have had some type of tour. I'm not quite sure, but he came to Milwaukee. And I can remember my mom, I was 11, and my mom had my sisters in a coaster wagon, and we walked about 4 blocks up to 16th Street, right behind the natatorium, and we sat on a triangle that, believe it or not, still had a horse trough, and it was full of water. There were still some people that still used horses, so they still had the horse trough. Mostly they were peddlers, ragmen, and vendors selling things off their cart, mercantile type vendors. But we sat by this horse trough and it had a little statue on it. And we watched Douglas MacArthur in a car going to downtown Milwaukee. And I can remember that clear as a bell.
Roberto, were you going to say something?
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, it was a different time, guys. When I in the late 40s and early 50s, it's completely different than what you got today. And
yeah, I mean, I was going to ask.
Roberto, you said it. It's technology and progress, but it was different.
Yeah.
I was going to ask. So since Douglas MacArthur was such a great general, was there a public outrage because of his being fired?
I didn't sense it. I mean, people lined the parade route. One of the things that's again different, the media. I mean, all you had in those days was the radio, a little bit of television. Television was starting to get popular in the early 50s. I remember my dad bought one in 1950, little 10-inch screen. But you know, the communication, what I'm saying is, I don't know how many people knew the politics behind why he was fired. They just knew he was a great general. He helped win World War II, and then he managed the reconstruction of Japan. Truman did appoint him as the supreme manager of Japan in their reconstruction. And then he appointed him as commander-in-chief of the Korean War. But that's where they had difference of opinion on how to progress that war. And that's where Truman relieved him of his command. But I don't know how many people knew that. They just knew he was a great general because of the way you got your news in those days. Many people just didn't know what was going on.
Okay. One other. This is a little different question, but what was your family life like? Because you had two older sisters, correct? And well, like with your parents, how was the family dynamic?
It was all right. I don't think that I played once I got maybe 6, 7 as much with my sisters as perhaps kids do today. Because like I suggested, we went to the playground a lot. But the big gathering together was supper, the evening supper. And we did not eat supper until 7 o'clock at night. And the family would gather together, and basically that's when we'd see our dad. We'd never seen our dad. He'd get out in the morning and he would come home about 6:30, and that's when we'd see our dad. The other thing in family life, we lived in a 2-bedroom flat, rented it until I was 16. My parents bought their first home when I was 16. And my 2 sisters at that time had their own bedroom, and I had my own small bedroom. And my mom and dad slept in a pull-out couch in the living room. And I remember, I mean, we never saw them sleeping. We were always in bed, except when I started my paper routes when I was 12. I'd get up early, and then I had to get out and go around the bed and to get outside and go to my paper route about 5 o'clock in the morning. And that was a complication or a part of family life that many families lived with. Crowded conditions, sleeping quarters were tight, and you had family communication and family meetings, and on the go. At breakfast with my sisters and my mom. Mom was, in those days, the mother was, she ran everything. Most men, worked hard to support their families. So I don't know if that's a sufficient answer to your question, but that's what I remember. I don't,
No, that was
again,
good.
I don't remember playing much after 6, 7 with my sisters. I was at the playground playing with my friends.
Anything to say, Roberto, for that? Any follow-ups?
Can't think of anything at the moment.
That's fine, because the next few questions I have kind of tie into this topic anyways. So what was Longfellow like, your grade school? What experiences do you remember? I guess anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, I can remember probably 2 things that pop into mind. One is penmanship. I vividly remember the penmanship and the lines and learning cursor, printing obviously first, and then cursor. But I also vividly remember the flashcards as a young first, second grader, maybe. Both mathematics and ABCs that they use. I can remember you had like a homeroom. Your class was same kids every day, all day long, except for physical education and for music. We'd go into a different room with different kids for music, where we learned music, songs, and those kinds of things. And it was only Longfellow, you only went to 6th grade. There was not a lot of programs. I do not remember, and I don't think we did any Christmas programs or any gatherings. I don't remember any gatherings from songs, where first grade would sing songs, second grade, so forth. We just sing in that music room, but there were no programs. The other thing I remember is Longfellow had fire escapes that were the sliding tubes like you get at McDonald's or whatever. And we always waited for the fire alarm to go off, because then we could go to the room. There were 2 of them. And from the 2nd and the 3rd floor, if you happen to be on those, it was great fun to slide down these fire escape chutes, they called them. The other thing I remember from Longfellow was couldn't wait to get to junior high school, but I remember we very seldom used the basement, but when I did get down there, I can remember what's in that room, and I looked into these rooms, and they had the Cub Scouts had their Cub Wolf pack and Bear pack or whatever, a room for them, and the Boy Scouts had theirs. And the Boy Scouts had, they built out of wood, birch logs and swing. They had stuff built in there out of wood. And I thought, boy, I'd like to do that. And I joined up the Cub Scouts and the Boy Scouts, and that's where I got my interest in scouting, was at Longfellow. Those are the primary things that I remember that probably, I mean, I know they're different today, particularly with the programming. I can't tell you why there wasn't that. I can remember that the other thing I remember is that the school superintendent would make tours of all the schools, and we had to be on our best behavior when the school superintendent came into our classroom. So.
Was it typical for boys to play sports at recess? And what other activities did boys do at the time? I guess you kind of already explained that, but
yeah, marbles, played on the monkey bars, played what they call pom-pom pull away, played baseball, chased each other around. The pom-pom pull away is kind of a dangerous game. I broke my collarbone being tackled playing pom-pom pull away. But the boys would line up and they'd play it. The recess was 15, 20 minutes. A lot of yelling and screaming and going on. I'm sure you guys had the same thing when you were in grade school, but that's kind of what I remember about recess. We went out even in the snow, in the rain, to play. So
I guess during the school, did you guys have like separate like social groups? Like boys would do one thing, girls would do the other type of stuff?
No.
No?
No, everything was together in the classroom setting. They did have different areas, work areas. If you were working on flashcards, somebody else might be working on penmanship or something like that. But it was just one big class. There weren't, but during recess, the boys would stay with themselves and the girls would stay with themselves. They would skip rope, and they had these hopscotch things painted on the asphalt playground, and they would do their double dutches and all that kind of stuff. So they separated from the boys.
What's a pom-pom pull away?
It's like a tackle football. You'd line up on one side of the playground and the guys would line out on the other side of the green. And it was kind of like musical chairs. The last man standing was the winner. So you did anything you had to get past the line to get to the other fence. And I don't know why they called it pom-pom pull away, but that's what it was called. So, there would be 50 kids on one fence and 50 boys on the other, and they'd charge each other and try and get through the line to the other side. And you were eliminated if you got pushed to the ground, basically. Then you're down to the last couple, and they're chasing each other around, trying to push them down on the ground. It was kind of a dangerous game. Like I said, I broke a collarbone playing that game. Another thing I remember in the winter, we used to make these long ice slides. We would throw the snow into a long line, and we just keep sliding until you get a slick surface. I mean, it was like ice, and it wouldn't melt. So you'd play it in the morning recess and the afternoon recess, and that was a lot of fun playing on those slides, making those slides.
Obviously nowadays a lot of parents are more, like you were saying, more are worried more of their safety of the kids. Do you think that's because there's not as much of that type of rough house? There definitely is, but do you think that's a good thing, bad thing, or any comment?
Well, yeah, probably the biggest change between now and then is that issue of independence. The parents let their kids do what they wanted to do at a much younger age. Safety and there weren't as many cars, and the neighborhoods were just teeming with kids. And the second major difference, parents were not involved with their children in games, playing baseball or whatever. Even in junior high, there weren't the type of volleyball teams or basically baseball for boys. That was it. Girls didn't have any sports competitions in junior. There was no softball. There was no basketball. Girls didn't play basketball. They played a form of volleyball, but parents were not involved. They didn't go to the games. If you played, if you were 10, 12 and you played Bunny Briefs hardball, there would be no parents very few at the game. And that's a big difference. Nowadays, parents go and watch their kids play soccer, volleyball, baseball. They're involved much more. My dad never went to anything. The only thing I can remember with my dad that participated in, because he liked it, was we went to, when I was in grade school or probably junior high, we went to Don Bosco High School Gymnasium to watch a boxing match. My dad every Friday night, he'd sit there and watch Friday night boxing. He was a big fan of boxing. And that's the only thing he ever took me to, was this boxing match. He never, until I was, maybe 14, 15, about 1955, 6, when the Brewers came. He would take me to Brewer games. But that was the only two things we ever did. We did hunting. He would take me on hunting trips, but never involved in sports. Mom as well. I cannot remember anything that she went to watch me participate in something until high school, where we would have band concerts and they would have tickets, and then she went into, she occasionally came to them. Not very often.
Okay.
So,
wow.
So that's the parent involvement.
Yeah,
is
definitely
much different than with their kids than it was in those days. But on the other hand, they let the kids run around independent, weren't worried about them. I think kids listen to their parents much better. They took the parents' advice about being safe and don't do dangerous things and watch the cars, and you were home at 5 o'clock when the street lights go on. You had to be home. I think kids listened a lot better than they do today.
Moving on to another question. So you talked about joining scouting. So what age did you join, and what made you want to join besides just seeing it? And like, why did you want to join necessarily, and what did you gain out of it?
Well, I joined it because of my interest in what I saw in those basement rooms. And I thought, I want to be part of a group that does this kind of stuff, because it was different. And it really turned out to be one of the best experiences of my young life, the Cub Scouting, more so the Boy Scouting, and more so even than that was the Explorer Scouts. And I wasn't a great athlete or didn't scouting, and my fellow scouts through my I'd say from 10 on was my big passion, was the thing that I was involved in besides, church groups, but scouting was something I looked forward to. The campouts, the meetings, and when we got in Explorer Scouts, I was part of a drum corps. We had a drum corps. Drum and bugle corps were big in the mid-50s. But going on week camps, going up to Canada, and it was the thing that took up, and I wanted to spend a lot of time doing scouting activities. I think that shaped my childhood. That and the fact that my parents were poor. Once I got to be a paper route, basically I was self-sufficient. But I had to work 2 paper routes. I worked the morning, the Milwaukee Sentinel was the morning, and the Milwaukee Journal in the afternoon. And with that and the scouting, my time was pretty much taken up. But I enjoyed scouting immensely.
Anything to add, Roberto?
You mentioned the paper, what was it? Paper outings, I think it was. And was that like a hobby or a job? You said, I forget.
It was a job. It was the way I got my spending money.
Okay.
And money for clothes. There were very few opportunities for kids, well, I'll say 14 and above, but because you could start paper routing at 12. You had to get a permit. You had to go downtown to Industrial Commission and get a permit so that you could be out on the street and you could work as somebody less than 16. But there were no jobs for young kids except for paper routes. When you got to be 15, 16, the only jobs that you could get in my time were soda jerk jobs or clerk jobs. Every corner had either a little grocery store or on the main arterials, a drugstore, a pharmacy. And the pharmacies in those days all had soda fountains. Some only 2 stools, some 4 stools. Some had 4 stools plus booths in the back. And those were the hangout places for the teenagers. They'd come in and buy phosphates and malts and sundaes and sit at the counters or in the booths. Well, the job of serving those teenagers was one of the opportunities that I had to get a job, or other kids. There were no fast foods in those days. You could clerk in a grocery store, run groceries to the neighbors. They would call up or they would come and they'd hire the 13, 14-year-old kids to run the groceries, carry them back to the houses, because everybody shopped at the neighborhood grocery stores. It wasn't until, I would say, early to mid-50s that finally a store came in, A&P, where they actually built a large grocery store. Outside of that, the corner grocery was where everybody got their stuff, and those were some job opportunities. So every boy trying to get a paper route was hard, because every boy wanted to get a paper route. But once you got one, you were good. As long as you wanted to keep that route, you were good. And it taught you a lot of things about time management, about money management, and responsibility and work ethics, and all those principles and values that we we try to learn as young children and teenagers. Paper route was a good teacher.
Okay. Anything else you want to talk about that? Just real
No.
quick. Okay. So you talked about how you wanted to be an engineer. So what was the earliest memory of, or just earliest idea that you wanted to be an engineer, and what influenced your desire to become an engineer through your preteen years?
I think the thing that comes to my mind was probably a sophomore in high school, Don Bosco High School I went to. And my paper route paid the tuition. My folks did not have tuition for private school. I was fortunate enough to get into Don Bosco through my parish, St. Matthew's parish, got me a slot at Don Bosco. But I had to pay, started out at $70 a year, and I think I was up at the end of the 4 years, about $120 a year. But all that money came out of my paper route. But I remember, with regard to your question on engineering, I had to make a choice about an elective. I think it was sophomore year. One would have led to perhaps a career in business, and the other one obviously led me to a career in engineering. I had to choose between a typing class or a drafting class, where you learn how to draft things. And I decided I didn't want anything to do with typing for whatever went through my mind at that time. And drafting looked to me kind of like when I saw the scouting exhibits, it struck my imagination, and I said, I think I want to take drafting. So I took that drafting class, and I'm positive that's what kind of led me into engineering. I, like many other kids, when you graduated, didn't really have a career in mind, other than I did know I wanted to start college in the engineering school. I did not have any feelings for business or economics or arts or any of those things. I like to build things as a kid and repair things, and so engineering seemed to me to be the field that I would go into. But in answer to your question, I think it was that choice between typing and drafting that led me to engineering.
So I guess now that, since you were talking about high school and your experience there, so many people nowadays have easy access to cars to get to high school. Was that, I'm guessing, was not the same back then, and was there such luxuries during your time of high school?
What's the exact question you want me to ask?
Like a lot of people nowadays just drive to school, high school students, once they get their driver's license. But like,
yes.
Back in your day, was it
at high school? We walked. We walked, or if you had money, which I did as a scout, for $2 you could buy a school bus pass for a week. $2 each week, as I recall, and you took the bus. When I was in high school, there was actually a bus that I took all the way, or we would walk. I can remember running to school because I would be late to high school. The grade school, Longfellow, was only a block away. In our neighborhood, they had grade schools all over the place. You didn't walk very far. But high school, I walked and or rode the bus. But prior to high school, in my neighborhood, if I wanted it, I used to go down to to the downtown, to the museum on Saturdays. We went on a streetcar. so we would, but the streetcars started to, by the time I started in high school, 54, 55, they were on many routes yet, but I think they disappeared completely in 58. And I went from 54 to 58 at Don Bosco. So we used primarily the bus, and the buses we used were the electric buses. They did not have the diesel buses yet. So these were the ones that had two arms that come up off the top of the bus, and they would go on to lines that were above the road. And that's how they propelled the buses. They were run on electric motors. Ultimately, they got rid of those and went to diesel-powered buses. And there were a few lines I could remember. 16th Street line was diesel-powered. But there were lots of wires and poles down every street for the buses, so that they could string wires and then run the buses. So that's how I got to high school. No cars. No, there were no parents. Very few parents drove their kids to school in high school in my day.
Did anyone in your high school have a car, and was that a major?
Yes. Well, I can remember Bob Castenholz. He had, when I was junior and senior, he had an old Model T that he drove to school. And once in a while, he would run me, well, actually it was a sophomore, because he'd drive me part way home, and then I'd walk the rest of the way. So that was the only fellow student that I knew had a car. And it was an old Model T with a rumble seat in the back. But it was great fun to ride in it.
Just in general, any other high school experiences that stood out to you?
Yeah, one thing that stood out to me, because as I suggested earlier, I wasn't a great athlete. I liked to play baseball and liked to play basketball, but I never got into competition to develop the skills completely. So when I got to high school, I didn't join any freshman basketball or anything like that. Kids that came out of the private school system, they had some competition, and they were into that when they got in school. What I got into was service. I became, I don't know what you want to call it, school service, either in the cafeteria, in the cleaning up of the classrooms. But I remember distinctly at the particularly as a freshman and a sophomore, at the dances and the concerts, and I would sit in the hallways, and we'd have the kids would come for sodas and popcorn and those kinds of things. And I was involved in school service almost all the way through. Serving at the masses in the gymnasium, ushering at the programs. That's what I did in high school, primarily because I didn't get into competition. And the biggest reason, besides not being real schooled in athletics, I had to be there for the evening paper route. I could not stay after school to play sports. Every day I had to get home to get those papers out to my customers. So that kind of formed my service at school, because those would be in the evenings or during school hours that I could provide service to the school.
Anything else you want to talk about high school before wrapping up that topic?
No, that's it. I mean, there's other things, but let's move on to some other stuff.
Well, we can have a little time for just one more high school story if you want. If anything, I don't really care.
Uh,
If you don't have any, I was just gonna say we could take a break now, but
yeah, I mean, high school is it was enjoyable. Um, they made you work hard, and you know, it was my first experience with because we were taught by Brothers of Mary. There were no lay teachers, so it was in a religious context that I went to high school, which was completely different than grade school and junior high, because I went to junior high, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, public, Walker Junior High. So it was different going to a private high school versus, or a parochial high school versus, I would have ended up going to probably South Division. Although my sisters, when we moved, because we moved, but when I lived on 22nd and Greenfield, and I would have went to South. When my sisters were in high school, we lived on 17th and Beecher, and they went to Pulaski. So.
all right. So do you want to take a break right now?
Sure, if you want.
All right. I guess we'll take a break and then we'll start again shortly.
Okay.
Okay, we're back. Let's start up again. So what did you do after graduating high school?
Well, I went to work with my dad that summer, and then I got accepted into Marquette University engineering, and I started school in the fall of '58 in the School of Engineering. And Marquette at that time had what they call a trimester. There was no 2-semester or 4 quarters. They had a trimester system. And I went for two sessions of the 3. And then I worked again with my dad in the summer. And then I ran out of money. So I went to UWM for a year and a half, again in engineering at UWM. And then ultimately I went back to Marquette and finished a degree at Marquette in civil engineering. So my work history was, my dad was a carpenter. And I helped and worked for him summers and weekends. I kept the paper out a long time, but when I graduated from high school, I quit the paper out, and I was 17 when I graduated, and worked with my dad. That was the only job I had until 1962, until September of 1962. Working with my dad, it was either school or work.
So I mean, if you want to talk anything about your college experiences, I think you kind of just touched up on everything. Just if you want, just want to give you the opportunity to.
Well, I did not have the normal college experience that most kids have. A lot of my coursework, except for UWM, but the first years at Marquette and the last years at Marquette were piecemeal. By piecemeal, I mean I took as many courses as I had money for. So I did not graduate in 4 years. And because I went piecemeal, I never developed a relationship with a group of fellow students. I did later on, but I did not graduate in 4 years either. it took me a long while going piecemeal. Either once I got married, I actually finished at night school after I got married. So, but when I got married, I worked for 2 months with my dad, and I got my first engineering job, if you will, in September of '62. I was married in July, and I got my first engineering job in September of '62. So my college experience was a lot different, a lot different. I did develop friendships with particularly at Marquette when I went at night school because there were a lot of us that did the same thing, went to school at night, and you developed friendships because every semester they would be there. We did have some normal college life at UWM, but part of going to UWM was interesting. The boys had to join the reserves. You did not have to go into the service, but while you were in college, you had to join the reserves, and they gave you a uniform. They tailored you, and you had a uniform, and you marched. And it's amazing how UWM has changed. They had a big field in the middle. I mean, it's all buildings now, and you marched and paraded. And I remember taking my wife, your grandmother Joey, to the military ball. We got pictures. Maybe you've seen them, maybe not, of her in her gown and me in my uniform. But so UWM for a year and a half was kind of but UWM had a split campus then. Most of my courses were taken in downtown Milwaukee. Very few that I had up at the main campus. But if you did, you traveled by bus from the downtown campus to the main campus. So it was different, I think, than what most kids experience today, except if you are one of the students that has to go part-time, you need to work or whatever, family responsibilities, whatever requires you, but you want to go. Today, it's a lot different. If you're one of those persons that doesn't go straight 4 years and get it all done in 3 or 4 years, now you can do it online. All over. I just seen a new one. It's University of Maryland Global courses or whatever. All the universities are, so you can be at home, you can work, and you can still graduate and get a degree and never touch a classroom. So that experience is going to be completely different than a 4-year college experience. So I was kind of in between. I had some at UWM where I went every day. I had enough money to go full-time for a year and a half. And I had part-time at Marquette at the beginning, and then I went a number of years at night school, and that was interesting because, again, it was a money issue. I was married, didn't have any children for the first few years of our marriage, but I did get a job in the engineering Bureau of Engineers of the city of Milwaukee, and they had a tuition reimbursement program. So I could take 3 to 6 credits a semester, and they paid for it. The city paid for my college. So in those days, even in the early 60s, you were lucky if you had a job that paid between $2,000 and $3,000 a year. Times were a lot different in those days, and tuitions were a lot less than what they are now. But even though if you didn't have well-to-do parents that could afford to pay the tuition for you, you somehow you had to work your way through college. So those I don't know what other experiences you know.
I mean, that was good. What was, you said you got married, but what was dating like, just after high school or in high school or during college, just in general?
Well, the big, in my, how shall I say, experience, but in my environment, the big social grouping was the neighborhood kids and your parish. I did not go to the grade school at St. Matthew's, but I belonged to the CYO, Christian Youth Organization. And almost all the Catholic and most of the kids in the neighborhood were Catholic. Boys and girls belonged to the CYO. And they had events and they have dances, and every parish, they would rotate, would have on Friday and Saturday nights would have dances. And that's where you went to hang out and meet girls. Or if you had a girl, that you went steady with, you would take her to the CYO dances. I never went steady with anybody until I was 20 when I met my wife. And I met her through my sister, but because they were high school classmates. But even so, so the dating was the CYO, movies. You went to movies, and I never had a car until I was 20. So you dated by a bus. I can remember taking girls down to the movies downtown or to Mitchell Street. Although where I lived, we had the Abbey Theater was right around the corner. There were a lot of neighborhood theaters on the south side that you could take a girl to. There were at least 6 of them on the south side. And you walked, but in my teen years, we'd go downtown, and the Strand, the Grand, big theaters, they'd have stages, and they would have stage acts. In the early years, in the early 50s, not early, mid 50s, the teen crooners or singers, they would come and sing at these show houses before the main event, which was the movie. So you'd get there early and you listen. I can remember taking your grandmother down there, and when we were dating, and we saw Paul Anka. He was actually younger than us. He was a Canadian, but he was starting to get notoriety on the radio. So they would come to these show houses and open, and they would be the opening acts. Those late 50s were probably the beginning of the entertainers going into venues and singing songs. A lot of the crooners went to the dance halls. There were beer dance halls all over the place, and they would get their reputations by going to those. But the dating was different. It was you didn't have many places to go, movie theaters, CYOs. There were some other group activities at Milwaukee Park System had a program where they would run events at many of the parks, and kids would go there as well. You went to band concerts. I can remember going to the wrestling. There was a wrestling arena on 6th and Mitchell. And it was a 6th Street Armory, I think they called it. I can't remember. You went there. So church functions, movies, and wherever else you wanted to go. There were few. There were no fast foods. There were a few sweet shops that you could go hang out. But mostly you went to pharmacies. You weren't dating, but you meet your friends there. And maybe you went to what we called greasy spoons, which were little mom and pop restaurants. Every neighborhood had one or two of them in the neighborhood, and you could go there and take your girl to get a hamburger. And then all of a sudden, a business called Dutchland Dairy opened up. And there were one in our neighborhoods, and you could go to the Dutchland Dairy and get, that's a forerunner of McDonald's and Big Mac. They'd have the ice creams and that, but you could also get chicken dinners. It was a more fancy restaurant than what we called the Greasy Spoons, where you got the blue plate specials. But from the Greasy Spoons came George Webb. That's what we would call a greasy spoon in my time. And you took your girls there. So the big thing is there wasn't that many places to take dates. You walked a lot. You went to the parks and hung out with your girl. You went ice skating in the winter with your girl. They did not have co-ed at the natatorium, so but they did have at the pools. Kosciuszko and Jackson Park were the closest ones that you could take a girl, and they did have evening swim hours, so you could go on a date swimming. But I guess that's my story about dating.
Yeah, that's good. So along that time, you said you went to a JFK rally in 1960.
1960, yeah, it was before the election, which was November of 1960. We couldn't vote. I was 20. You had to be 21 in those days. My wife was 19. My sister was 19. And the younger sister, not the youngest, was 17. They had boyfriends. I don't remember what they were. But John F. Kennedy came to Milwaukee to campaign. And I'm sure he gave a speech or something at some place. But he had a cavalcade of cars going down Wisconsin Avenue. And I distinctly remember we all went down, my two sisters, their boyfriends, and myself and my wife. She wasn't my wife yet. We were dating, and or had just started dating in 1960. And we went down there to see John F. Kennedy in his parade, and he was sitting on the back of a convertible. And I could remember it was crowded, but not that crowded. And you could get right up to the convertible line. I mean, they went off the curbs, the crowd, and just let one lane of traffic. And as he was going by, he was high-fiving people, and I can remember we got high fives. And my sister, oldest sister, she actually tried to grab him and hug him. But that's my experience with JFK, and we followed the news as best we could. And had we been able to vote, I'm sure all of us would have voted. The girls were swooning over Kennedy, like they did for the Beatles. And But we were young adults then. We weren't just teenagers, 13, 14, 15, going to a concert like they do today and yelling and screaming. We were in our late teens and 20s. That's my story about John. I mean, I remember watching him on TV because I was interested in politics. I can remember the 56 convention where he was running for vice president, watching it on TV, and then watching his campaign in the 59 and 60 when he was leading up to his run for president on TV, too, watching the politics of that campaign.
So did it come as a shock, like when JFK was assassinated? Where were you? And what was the reaction?
Yes, very definitely. I was sitting at my drafting table, listening to the radio in the afternoon. I think it was around 2 or 3 o'clock, somewhere in that, when it came through, and we couldn't believe what we were hearing. I distinctly remember that moment. And then I remember we worked to the end of the day, and it was on I'm thinking it was a Thursday, and they called off work for Friday. We didn't have to show up. And I can remember on Friday sitting there watching TV with my wife. And Saturday, the same thing. We watched TV all day, watching what was going on. I was watching the TV when they brought out this Jack Ruby guy, and I saw the guy go up and with the gun and shoot him in the stomach on TV. So it was interesting. A lot of commentary. They did not have the videos like they got today. They had some movies and some videos that they got from people with cameras. There were no video cameras. These were regular cameras, expensive, so not many people had them. But they did get some of those from the people of the parade route and I'm sure you've seen them on TV, where they show the guy running to the back of the car, and he jumps up on the back on the trunk and trying to protect them, and then the car takes off and goes to the hospital. But it was quite a traumatic time. You couldn't hardly believe what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, anything else with the whole, I think you covered it very well. But another thing is like the Cuban Missile Crisis. What was your reaction? Was it scary? Was it tense?
Yeah. It was scary to us. I can't remember if it was summer of 62 or summer of 63. He was killed in November of 63. But the Cold War, I mean, we got married in 62 in July, and we were becoming more cognizant of the world around us and the Cold War, and more involved politically, and watching television, the news. We used to love to watch the news. Everybody watched the news at 5 and 6 and 7 o'clock. Cameron Swayze, and I can't remember some of the other anchors, early anchors, but everybody, and like I said, in those days, people ate late, 6, 7 o'clock. If you ate at 5 o'clock, you were unusual. Who eats at 5 o'clock? But you'd sit there and watch the news. So we saw about the crisis and watched what we saw on the news, and were concerned that the nuclear war would start. And there were still civil defense shelters and schools, and they were provisioned with water and crackers and all that stuff. And we were told to find out the closest civil defense place that you could run to if they came, if the warning came. And so there was some concern. I don't think we didn't have hysteria, but there was concern. And recently reviewing the history of it on the History Channel, they didn't really tell us everything that they knew over the news. The government, just let out what they had to leave out. But it was very, very close to a nuclear striking back and forth. The more you learn about the history of it. So they tried to tone it down so there wouldn't be mass hysteria at the time it was happening by not telling you everything.
Wow, yeah, it's interesting. I wanted to switch topics a little bit to the civil rights movement. So I was wondering, so just in general, what do you remember about the civil rights movement? And also, do you have any stories of the Milwaukee riots of 1967, especially?
Yes. Father Grappi was the champion of civil rights in the 65, 66, 67. And he was a parish priest. I can't remember the parish, but it was on the north side, in the north of what they called the Black neighborhood, which is around Walnut, 3rd and Walnut. A little bit north of there, and I can't remember what street it was on. He was a parish priest, and he started to petition and fight for the rights of the Blacks, and particularly the youth, the 16 to 20-year-olds. And it might have been where he got involved in the CYO, where this started, because that was the age that the kids were involved in the CYO a lot. But they started marching, and it got more, I'm not going to say violent, because it wasn't really violent, but there was a lot of yelling and screaming on these marches. And then the spectators would come out and they would yell and scream back and forth. And there was this huge march down 16th Street across the viaduct. And they went all the way down almost to Beecher Street. We lived on 17th and Beecher, and they came down to Forest Home Avenue, which is very close to Beecher Street on 16th Street. And that's where it ended. I did not go out and view it personally. I watched it on TV, but ultimately they named that viaduct because of that march. The 16th Street Viaduct became I think it's still called the Grappi Viaduct. I forget his first name, but it didn't touch us in the South Side very much. It was a near North Side area of protest. The closest it got, it was that march, and I think that was the reason why he wanted to do that. He wanted to spread this mission he had to the South Side, but to the Polish, and it wasn't, the South Side at that time was not Hispanic at all. There were a few, but it was mostly Polish, some Germans, but mostly, densely Polish, the near South Side. And he wanted to spread that movement down here, but the Polish didn't react much to it, to their plight, if you will, and join the protests.
just any, I mean, we can move on to another topic, but any other big things that stick out about the civil rights movement?
No, I think it's different today than it was then. Um, it on a national level, it was heating up more with Lyndon Johnson as president. He took on championed the civil rights for the minorities, and some of that and the activities around that, and the protests in Alabama and Georgia was what led to Groppe and trying the protests in here in Milwaukee. Milwaukee did make the national news with Groppe and his protests, though, as I recall. So it was enough to make the national news. But I don't recall any looting or fire bombings or any of that kind of stuff that took place. Maybe it did, but I don't recall any of it. It wasn't a big deal. It was just marching, and the fear was more of these, as I recall, of these what they call the Black Panthers, or the militant black youth, 18, 19, 20, early 20s, marching and yelling and doing their fists and all that the white folks maybe got fearful from. That's what I remember.
Oh, okay. Thank you for sharing about that. So you were in your mid-20s when the Vietnam War kind of heightened in the U.S. and they started the draft. Were you ever needed for the draft or exempt from it somehow?
Oh, we had to have a draft card, and so I signed up at 21, which I think was the law at that time. So I had a draft card, and I was at the beginning. That would be 62, because I was December 30th of 61. I was 21. So starting in 62, I was 1A, which means you're the top priority. And that's where most kids were. It started in about 64, I think, 63, 64, when Kennedy reluctantly started putting troops in there. And then Johnson in 64 really escalated it in 64, 65. And that's when they started 4 and 5, when they started drafting people to go into the Army. And of course, your fear was, the reason they started the draft is that they took the standing Army, the people that were in the Army at that time, and took them to Vietnam. So they needed to replace these people, and that's where they started drafting. So not necessarily that you'd go to Vietnam, but that you replaced the people that went there. But ultimately, the fear was that you were going to go to Vietnam and have to fight this war. So I was married, didn't have any children at the time, but I was in engineering, essential engineering job at that time. And it was 66, I think it was, where I went to the city engineer and I asked, could you write a letter to my draft board saying I had a critical job, which he did. And that was 66. And then in 67, April, my daughter was born. And I went back in at that time and said, I'm married. Would you change my draft status? And they did. So I never got to the point where they went into what they call a lottery. And your birth date was one of 365. And the lottery was, whoever it was, picked one of the 365 numbers. And that was the top priority. So if you were born on day 300 and that was the first number picked, you were the number one person to be drafted. So as I recall, my birth date was quite a ways. It was lower than the middle. So it would have took a lot of people to draft. So I wasn't too worried, but they did change my draft status to, I can't remember what the one married or whatever. The only other draft status that I recall was what they called 4F. That's where if you had a medical reason, you were 4F. That meant that they couldn't take you because you had bad eyesight, or you limped, or you lost a limb, or you had you were obese and you couldn't pass the physical. You became 4F. So you were assured you wouldn't be drafted. But those are the stories I remember about being drafted. Cheryl and I were very worried, though, in 65, particularly in 66, as Lyndon Johnson escalated and ended up putting 500,000 troops into Vietnam. We were worried that our life was going to get, particularly we didn't have any children. Not that we didn't want any, it just didn't happen to us for 4 years, 5 years before. Well, she had one, but she lost it before my daughter was born in 67. So then we felt secure that we wouldn't get drafted. And then my daughter, which is Joey's mother, kind of protected us. And then we had my son in 69.
What was your view on the war as it progressed and after it was resolved, I guess? What was just your general opinion?
I was kind of neutral about it. I didn't really understand why we were doing what we were doing, other than they wanted to stop the spread of communism. And when North Korea, on the basis of, which was a communist regime at that time, on the basis of wanting to be a single state, attacked South Korea. We got involved because, I don't think because they attacked them in the single state issue or one country issue, not a North and a South. It was because we were fearful that they were spreading communism, that the Chinese were behind this, which turned out to be true, and that they were going to spread communism. And we took that stance in Europe that we were going to stop communism. We wouldn't allow it to expand in Europe, so we weren't going to allow it to expand in Asia. And I think that was the overriding policy of why we got involved in it. But, you know, as a prospective soldier, what's the sense of that? You know, I mean, they're a long ways away from us. Why are we involved? So I was not protesting against it. I did not get involved in the protests at all. There were many in 67, 68, 69. The college kids at that time were ones that protested the war. Some groups got very passionate about it, about the war, and protested against it, just like some Black groups got involved with protesting the civil rights during the civil rights movement. This was mostly white. The protests on the Vietnam War were mostly white males, particularly, and some of them got very passionate. There were some bombings. UW Wisconsin had a bombing at that time, protesting the Civil War, and I can't remember if Kent State shooting was involved with that or not, but
yeah, it was, I believe.
It was. um, the shooting of students, particularly college kids, got very impassioned about it. Fearful that they might get drafted, but they took a hard line that they didn't see any sense at war. I did not have that hard line in my mind. I was kind of ambivalent about that, about the Vietnam War. So those are my stories about the Vietnam War, I guess.
All right, thank you for sharing. Is there anything else that you would like to share before we wrap up that you would want to be in the interview? Just any of your stories?
Just a story of a little bit more about becoming an engineer, and the experience that I had in the late 50s, early 60s, and mid 60s, until about 1965, was becoming an engineer. It was different. The principles and values and the education of an engineer is the same today as it was back then. But how you learned it and how you developed your career was completely different. You used longhand, division, multiplication. You used books of sines and cosines and logarithms, and you used manuals of formulas. There were no calculators. You had to add long lists of calculations. You had to do long multiplications. And I'm talking about learning algebra, calculus, fluid dynamics, hydraulics, all the engineering, electronics, all the steel design, all the things you learned in school was done with manuals and by hand. Then you started to use what they called beginning calculators, but prior to that, you had slide rules, and the slide rules got much more complicated. But that's how you did your instead of looking up in a manual logarithms, you could find them on a slide rule. That started. Then you got initially in about 63, they came out, Hewlett-Packard came out with the first calculator. And all it did was add and subtract, multiply, and divide. It may have had a memory on it. I can't remember if the first ones did. And all of a sudden, the hand calculators got more prevalent, and you could start using those. But engineers had Olivetti machines that were hand cranked. You push in the numbers and you'd hand crank. And then they got electronic Olivettis where you punched in the numbers and you crank them. And of course, then the calculators came out. The big change was 1964 when they came out with the computer, the 1401 IBM computer. And when that came out, that was the beginning of the computer revolution. Although the computer itself was invented in 1951 with the UNIVAC. The Defense Department used it. But the actual business computer came out in 64, 65 with the 1401. And then from there, the big change, because I remember going down to Marquette, going to the computer lab, using the 1401, doing my hydraulics and my big calculations that I didn't have to do by hand or on the computer, the hand computer. They did them on the mainframe. with punch cards. But the next big generational change was in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, the personal computer. Once the personal computer was invented, then education and how you learn things, you're learning the same thing, but it's so much easier and so much more, the ability to get it done is, and productivity is much greater. So what I wanted to convey about the 60s primarily was the learning of my career was much different, much different than it was today. And the big fear I have is nowadays, do kids really understand long division? Do they understand the formulas, where they come from? Now you can call up Siri or Alexa and say, what's the quadratic formula? And they'll give it to you.
Sorry, I'm having trouble understanding.
Oh, I'm sorry. Alexa off. You had to use manuals, and you developed, I developed a great big handwritten book of all the formulas and manuals that I had to use as an engineer, because you didn't have the computers, and it's just amazing how we used to do it, but the end result is the same. That's my story.
All right, Roberto, anything you want to add?
No.
All right, thank you.
You guys know what a log slide rule looks like? I bet you never saw one.
I'm not.
I don't know. I don't believe so.
And I can remember that I was out engineering, and we had to add up long lists of engineering quantities out in the field and the construction sites. And my wife spent $100 back in 63, 64, 65, somewhere's in there, for that first adding machine. And $100 in those days is like $1,000 now. But boy, did that make a difference. Sitting out there in the field office and adding up your quantities with a calculator versus long lists that you had to add up by hand.
Okay, well, I think that was, thank you for your time, and thanks for staying here for interviewing us.
Thanks for having me.
You.
All right, thank you.